Who's the front runner at quarterback? How good can this Bearcats defense be? And who in the world is going to start on the offensive line and at wide receiver? We're breaking down all the top storylines ahead of spring practice today on Locked On Bearcats.
Locked On Bearcats, your daily podcast on the Cincinnati Bearcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The start of a new week, and we thank you very much for making Locked On Bearcats your first listen of every day. It's free and available everywhere that you get your podcasts, including right here on YouTube. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us to get an alert every time we drop a new episode. My name is Alex Frank, your host each and every day here on Locked On Bearcats. We're part of the Locked On podcast every day. It's Monday, and I'm not sure if this is going to be a weekly thing, but we'll call it today Meyer Mondays. That's because we've got Neil Meyer of the Front Office News joining us today here on Locked On Bearcats as spring practice gets underway today for Bearcats football in year one under Scott Satterfield. Neil, it's great to have you on. I first want to ask you, and this might be the $64 million question, the obvious question. What is your biggest storyline as spring practice kicks off today?
Yeah, so spring practice kicks off, the first one under Scott Satterfield as he enters his first year as head coach of the Bearcats. But I think the biggest thing we have to address with spring ball is it's either going to be the wide receiver room or what will the offensive line look like. I mean, this is a wide receiver room who you lost so much production with guys like Tyler Scott, Trey Tucker. You lose two guys who were such a key part of your offense. Then you see guys transfer in and out. Nick Mardner transferred to Auburn. And then you lose a guy like Josh Wiley, Lenny Taylor. So you lose your two predominant tight ends as well. So you're losing almost 80% of your offense there on the outsides. And then you're losing a whole offensive line just about due to going to the NFL, graduating. You see guys transfer. So I think they're only looking to return one guy on the offensive line who saw significant playing time from last season, and that's Gavin Gerhardt. And he was, for many who don't know, he was filling in for a guy in Jake Renfro who was out for the season due to a knee injury.
Yeah, I mean, and I love that you went there, Neil, because I think, excuse me, with a team like the Bearcats and the quarterback battle, I think that would have been the easy answer. But I agree with you because I think to me, when you look at these two positions, offensive line and wide receiver, they've been positions of strength for the last few seasons. And as you mentioned, the offensive line, we thought it was going to be the strength of the offense last year. And then Jake Renfro, days before the season starts, he's lost for the season. Gavin Gerhardt fills in admirably. And Lorenz Metz, like Jake Renfro, didn't really stay healthy the whole season. So the offensive line became almost a liability as opposed to a reliable source. And then the wide receivers, which got better under Luke Fickell. Now you essentially, I mean, as someone asked this, I think it was Chad Brendel at Thursday's press conference with Scott Satterfield, are receivers still wearing the "hello, my name is" card? Because like you wonder who's who. And we can talk about the quarterback, and we will, but I look at the offensive line for a program that has been driven through the trenches for the last 20 years, and an offensive line that was a huge part of that playoff team in 2021. You covered that team like I did. And then wide receivers, again, it's just a matter of who's who. And yeah, there's going to be a new quarterback, but Neil, who are they going to have to throw the ball to? Like, when you look at these two positions, if you had to project starters right now, besides Gavin Gerhardt, I mean, who is going to start at these positions, especially after we found out Thursday that Keyshawn Helton, the transfer from Florida State, it sounds like he's potentially not going to – I feel like I might be going too far with this, but it sounds like he's not going to potentially play at all this season. Is that where we're getting there?
So basically, from what Scott Satterfield said about Keyshawn Helton was that it was due to a hip injury that he sustained while prior to coming to the University of Cincinnati, he did say in Thursday's press conference that he has not been cleared yet medically, and he would not be participating in spring ball. So that's something to keep an eye on. Obviously, they had big expectations for Helton when he transferred in from Florida State. But within that wide receiver room, you're returning just one guy who was on that team a year ago. Obviously, you see guys like Tyler Scott, Trey Tucker go to the NFL. Drew Donnelly transfers out. Then you see guys, Nick Mardner goes to Auburn. But the only guy returning from that wide receiver room that was on this team, because Quincy Burrows and Will Pauling both followed Coach Fickell to Wisconsin. For those who haven't been following along, those two were the sky was the limit for both of those two. They both had unmatched potential. Quincy Burrows, we saw it all throughout camp. He was a freshman this season. However, Burrows' potential is through the roof. He's a big body receiver. He can really go up and get it. And then you have a guy in Will Pauling who is just that speedster out the slot with great hands, great route running skills, but the speed was there. And that's what made him so good out of the slot and a valuable weapon under Luke Fickell the last season before he sustained, I believe it was an MCL injury heading into the final stretch of the season. He got hurt and then he got healthy, overcame that injury to get back to play. But the only guy returning in that wide receiver room from the 2022 team is Chris Scott. And I think the world of Chris Scott. Like, I think the potential is there for Chris. We have seen it at practice covering this team for the last 3 years. Obviously, Chris is a guy who works hard every day, works hard on his craft. But Chris Scott would be the name to keep an eye on within that wide receiver room. Now that Keyshawn Helton's out for injury, I think Chris Scott's going to take veteran leadership role, really kind of embrace that leadership role, build the culture within that wide receiver room. But then you also bring in guys like D. Wiggins, who spent time at Louisville. And then you have Sterling Buckhalter, who's from Cincinnati, but went to North Carolina State and then transferred back home for his final year of his college eligibility. So those are some names to keep an eye on within that wide receiver room. But then you mentioned the offensive line and some names to keep an eye on there. Luke Kandra, another Cincinnati native who followed Scott Satterfield from Louisville. He's a big guy to keep an eye on. I believe he's like 305, big, strong kid. He's like 6'4". He was highly recruited out of high school, was arguably one of the top offensive tackles in that class. However, you put him alongside a guy like Trevor Rosecrans from Penn. If I pronounced his last name right, I think I might have botched it. However, those are two big transfers that they really prioritized this offseason, was really addressing that offensive line.
Yeah, it's definitely two positions that were heavily addressed, and I'm interested in seeing if the receiving core and the offensive line, is it largely made up of transfers, or are there guys on this roster that ultimately become starters? Because I think about offensive line, Neil, I think about a guy like John Williams, who started that 21 season and then was passed by James Tunstall last year. And Tunstall had an up and down season. I don't think the season many of us expected. And then I think about the offensive linemen. I go through the roster and I'm like, well, I haven't really seen these guys play. And then I go through the wide receivers, and a lot of them haven't seen significant playing time. You mentioned Chris Scott, but we haven't seen him in high leverage moments. And that, to me, is an issue, especially going into the Big 12, which a lot of Bearcat fans listening to this know is a pass-heavy conference. Now, I've said on this show many times that you can win by running the football in that conference. We'll touch on the running backs as well. I want to also ask you about the quarterback battle. And is Emory Jones, which I think right now I would say is the presumed starter, but is that necessarily a good thing for the Bearcats? We'll get into all of that after I tell all of our listeners, Bearcats, how it is brought to you today by Built Bar. Neil, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Built Bar. I don't know if you listen to Locked On Bearcats or Locked On Bengals. Yeah, you listen to Locked On Bearcats. You're a guest on today's show. But if you've listened to these shows, you know for a delicious treat but don't want all of the fat and calories, then you got to try a Built Bar. We just got through the holidays, and I know my goal is to eat a little healthier this year. If you're like me, where you want to eat healthier but don't want to compromise taste, then man, I've got just the thing for you. You got Built. Healthy's actually tasty. Seriously. They're so delicious you won't think they're good for you, and they're perfect for your New Year's resolution. Are we still making those? What makes Built Bars so good? Well, for starters, they are all covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and coconut almond. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. And what's even better is that they are healthy. Only 130 calories and 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com. Now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart today, walk to the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate or coconut puffs. If you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, brownie batter and churro. You can thank me later. Thanks again for making Locked On Bearcats your first listen every day. Make sure you check out our brand new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. Everything you need to know about college basketball in one place. Plus, hear from big insiders, coaches, and players. Locked On College Basketball is available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. It's Monday, March the 6th, here on Locked On Bearcats. Neil Meyer from the Front Office News joining today. Neil, the quarterback battle is really, it's interesting because there are a lot of players involved in it. Emory Jones, Ben Bryant, Evan Prater, Brady Drogosh, and then you've got some other names in there as well. Where are you right now? Who do you make as the front runner heading into spring ball today?
Yeah, so heading into spring ball, everyone kind of knows the offense Scott Satterfield has run. And we saw that at Louisville when he had Malik Cunningham over the last few years, which was one of the most dynamic quarterbacks in all of college football.
Yep.
Just the capability of what he was able to do with his arm and his legs. He was really able to impact games in both ways. So I think a dual threat quarterback really fits the mold of what a Scott Satterfield offense looks like. Now, whether that is a Emory Jones or a Evan Prater. However, you cannot count Ben Bryant out of this quarterback battle, debate, whatever they would call that going on. Ben Bryant's now back for his 6th year. He has 2 years of starting under his belt. Obviously, he started at Eastern Michigan before coming back to Cincinnati last season, where his season was cut short due to an injury. And then you look down the roster, you have guys like Brady Lickenberg. Brady Lickenberg has had a fantastic offseason. He has been working all the time. He is someone that is continuously out there getting extra work in from what I have seen on social media. However, you cannot count anybody out within this quarterback battle. I know that's something Scott Satterfield has preached in his press conference earlier this week. He said, no matter if you started last season or here before, this battle is for anybody, and it's no one's guaranteed anything. You have to earn it. So that's something that's cool, like for Scott Satterfield. But this quarterback battle, it's going to be fun to watch. I know he's hit on it in his press conference too, that he's got a pocket passer in Ben Bryant, and then you have two dual threat guys in Emory Jones and Evan Prater. But Emory Jones has also been able to beat teams with his arms. Obviously, he started his career at Florida, where he was, I believe if I remember right, he got benched for Anthony Richardson, who is now a first-round projected draft pick in this upcoming NFL draft. And then he transferred to Arizona State. Obviously, I don't think he had the season he was expecting out there due to all the circumstances that went on out there in Arizona State. You obviously had the coaching changes and all that. But however, I think a fresh start for Emory Jones was what was needed. And I'm very curious to see how spring ball progresses. But, I mean, it will be something to keep an eye on. I know Ben Bryant's coming off a season-ending foot surgery where he injured his foot during the Temple game, so he missed the final 2.5 games of the season, including the bowl game. But Ben Bryant's going to be on a limited basis heading into spring, Scott Satterfield announced on Thursday. So I think they said the goal is for Ben Bryant to be around 100% coming out of spring break. That way he'll be fluid transitioning back into the practicing every day. But it sounds like Ben Bryant will start spring ball on a limited basis while he still rehabs from that foot injury.
I think you bring up a great point about Ben Bryant, because he's still here. And that is significant because, and here's the thing, Neil, and I've been thinking about this for the last week. Emory Jones, I think, fits Scott Satterfield's system the best. But yet Ben Bryant might have the most experience. And I know a lot of Bearcat fans were frustrated about the way he played at times last season. But if you remember those first 4 games, really 3.5 games, I should say. If you remember the first 3.5 games, first 3 games, and the first half of the Indiana game, Ben Bryant was one of the best quarterbacks, not only in the American Athletic Conference, but statistically, he was up there with some of the best quarterbacks in the country. So I know his mobility last year was comical sometimes, but if he can come back from that foot injury and if he throws well in camp, which he did last year, I'm not going to put it past him for him to have a chance to win the starting quarterback job. This is his 6th college football season. He's played for 2 different programs. He's been through a coaching changes before. He's played under multiple offensive coordinators. Emory Jones has too. But as you said, Neil, and I'm going back through his game logs, Emory Jones in his 2 seasons that he started. They're solid, not great. I thought his Florida season in 2021 was better than I thought. But I just think about Ben Bryant still being here, being significant. But another player, Evan Prater, Neil, I think is the most fascinating player on the team because of the pedigree he brought in as a high-level recruit and the fact that he hasn't lived up to that potential. And there are obviously a myriad of reasons why he hasn't. In the 2 games, very good. But to me, and I want to know what you think about this, they weren't in the most ideal circumstances. He had to come in a winner-take-all game against Tulane, and then he had to play in a bowl game with a depleted roster where you had players changing their numbers at halftime. I mean, that's not – I wouldn't want to be a quarterback in that situation. So give me your thoughts on Evan Prater, and does he have a chance to push to maybe win this starting quarterback job?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question. I definitely think Evan Prater has a shot to push Ben Bryant and Emory Jones for that starting quarterback job. But you mentioned it last season. He obviously came in. His first start was on versus Tulane. He had the 31-game home winning streak on the line. I think it was like a 2 p.m. kickoff.
Yeah.
It was not the ideal environment for him to start. Obviously, that Tulane team was a very good Tulane team, and we saw that in the Cotton Bowl when they took down USC. That's a good Tulane team. That Willie Fritz is doing a fantastic job down there in Tulane. But overall, Evan Prater is one of those guys who can do many things. He can run the ball and he can throw the ball. And that's been something that most teams and fans have been wanting to see is, hey, when is this going to be the time to show? And then Ben goes down with the injury against Temple. And then next thing you know, Evan's forced to come in for the second half of that game. They get the job done on the road. But then his first true start has a lot at stake because if they win that game, not only if they win that game, do they keep that home winning streak alive, which was the second longest in college football at the time. But if they win that game, they secure a spot in the AAC championship game for the 3rd straight season. So that's what a lot of people have to think about was there was a lot of things weighing on Evan Prater's shoulder within that. But then you flash forward, that Tulane game was a close one. It came down to a field goal. But then you flash forward to the bowl game. You're looking down at your roster. You have literally 90% of your offense opts out for the bowl game. You lose Trey Tucker, Tyler Scott, Nick Mardner, Josh Wiley, Lenny Taylor, Jaden Thompson transferred to Louisville. That's 90% of your offensive production right there. And then you have Corey Kiner in the backfield with Ryan Montgomery. Montgomery was battling injuries all season. So then overall, there's not much production left. They had Drew Donnelly on the outside. They had Chris Scott on the outside. And then tight ends, they had Shimon Mateer. Shimon wasn't 100% healthy last year, from as many of us know. He ended up having shoulder surgery that Scott Satterfield announced that he's still rehabbing from. and missed time with that shoulder injury during the season. But everyone knows the potential Shaman has. However, you're throwing a guy out there in a bowl game situation with not a lot of people he didn't have for his first 2 games out there. And that's the situation. Like, people will always question, what if they didn't opt out? But it wasn't just him not having the players. It was the fact that Coach Fickle had just left. Kerry Combs was taking over the team for the bowl game, was the interim head coach. They announced Scott Satterfield, and it just happens to be that situation where they're not just playing Louisville at that moment. They're playing a Louisville team that lost their head coach to their rivals. And if I remember reading correctly, that Louisville team only had 4 coaches for that bowl game, including GAs at the time.
Yeah.
So they were down shorthanded, but man, did they get the job done. So you have to give your hats off to the Louisville program down there. I think they did a fantastic job heading into that. But overall, I think the sky's the limit within the quarterback room. And I'm very excited to see how Evan Prater handles this offseason heading into spring ball.
Really excited to see that. Really excited because I don't know if you can legitimately take away much from the 2 games that he started. Yes, he struggled as a passer, but again, as you said, Neil, there was a lot on the line in that first game. I mean, heck, both of the longest winning streaks in college football went down that same weekend because Clemson lost the next day and they had the longest streak. And then the bowl game, I mean, what can you really take away from that game? The Bearcats offensive line allowed 7 sacks. I don't really take away much from that game. And I still know that Evan Prater has a lot of talent. And I just think maybe coach and the right offensive coordinator, that can be unlocked. Speaking of which, give me your thoughts on the new coordinators for the Bearcats, Brad Glenn on offense, Brian Brown on defense, and then how good do you think this defense can be? Because Neil, I look at this defense, and there's a lot of familiar faces: Deshaun Pace, Jaheim Thomas, Jawan Briggs, Malik Vann, Dante Corleone, who we heard speak on Thursday at the spring ball press conference. How good do you think this defense can be under a new coordinator in Brian Brown, who Louisville's defense last year, Brown was their defensive coordinator, they ranked in the top 25 in a lot of statistical categories. So your thoughts on the new coordinators and how good this defense can be this year?
Yeah, so Brad Glenn is coming from Virginia Tech. He is the guy who was on Scott Satterfield's staff from, I believe, 2005 to 2008 back at Appalachian State. But he is a guy that has that familiarity with Scott Satterfield. So Brad Glenn is a guy who I'm very excited to see how he will get involved with this offense. Now, whether it's in the passing game or in the run game. However, it's going to be a fun thing to watch just because he's had so much success. Obviously, he's been around to a few different stops. I believe he was at Western Carolina for a little bit. And then he recently just left Virginia Tech to come here after Tom Manning went to the NFL with the Colts. So obviously it's a different aspect from Tom Manning to Brad Glenn, however, but as Scott Satterfield said, if your coaches are getting poached to go to the NFL, that's how you know you hired a pretty dang good staff. And if there's teams calling already for the NFL to get those guys in there for positions in this coaching cycle at the next level in the pros, that's how you know you built that staff right. But Brad Glenn, I'm very excited to see how it goes. Obviously, the Bearcats are returning everybody in the backfield. So you're returning a guy like Corey Kiner, Ryan Montgomery. Ryan Montgomery is one of those guys who's a Swiss Army knife. He can beat you up the middle. He's a guy who runs hard. He's also a guy who can do so much on special teams. He's a very good punt returner, very good kick returner, but he can also be so dynamic in the passing game. However, this is an offseason where Ryan Montgomery is coming off it. He's going to be limited in spring ball to start as well, as he had an offseason procedure done. So overall, Brad Glenn, I'm thrilled. I'm very fired up to see what he will bring to the offense in this spring ball. But let's flip the page to the defensive side. As you mentioned, Coach Brian Brown. Brian Brown joined Satterfield from Louisville, where this is a Louisville team that led the nation in sacks, was top 5 in forced fumbles and turnovers. But man, Brian Brown, I will say this, his defenses love to get to the quarterback. And you mentioned some very big names there. This is a defensive line that is returning 90% of their production from a season ago. Obviously, you have Malik Van returning for his super senior season after missing all of last season due to a torn pec. So having Malik Van come back, for one, is a huge, huge impact for Brian Brown on the defensive aspect, and Walt Stewart, who coaches the defensive lines. But then you look across that defensive line, you have Jawan Briggs, who's an absolute unit. Everyone who's been around Jawan Briggs and been around this program, covered this team, knows Jawan Briggs is just a absolute freak in the trenches. But then you have a guy who is now a sophomore in Dante Corleone, who broke onto the scene in 2022, was a first-team All-American as a freshman. So to see the production there, obviously, you mentioned the bowl game earlier. Dante Corleone didn't play in that bowl game due to injury, but Corleone is healthy, and we've talked to him earlier this season. And I mean, it seems like everyone is fired up to get to work under Coach Brian Brown. And I mean, if you're a linebacker, you got to think whether it's Dorian James, who transferred in from Louisville, Deshaun Pace, and then you have Jaheim Thomas in there. Like, Jaheim Thomas was held behind guys like Ivan Pace, Joel DeBlanco over the last few years. Then you also saw him split time with Will Huber, Ty Van Fossen. So right now, if you're looking at that linebacker room, those are 3 names to keep an eye on within that linebacker room, because they have big shoes to fill. Everyone knows the success that Ivan had, but then you also have to think of what Will Huber did over his career. Obviously, he stayed his 6 years, and man, he started as a tight end, turned out to be a key contributor for that linebacker room for the last season or two, from the 2021 to 2022 teams. But then you have a guy, Ty Van Fossen, was also filling in. So that's where you lost most of your production on the defense, was in that linebacker room. And then you lost some guys on the defensive back aspect as well. But I'm thrilled to be fired up. We mentioned the defensive line. They bring in a guy like Daniel Grisiak from Utah State. And man, I don't know if you, Alex, have watched Daniel Grisiak's film, but can he get to the quarterback? And that's a very exciting thing, because you look down, you say Grisiak, Malik Van, Dante Corleone, Jawan Briggs. Say realistically, those are your 4 at the defensive line. Obviously, we don't know for sure yet, because we haven't seen anything. We haven't been to practice. We don't know what observations are yet. But that's a pretty nasty top 4. And that's 4 guys who love to get to the quarterback. So that's something to really look forward to. But this defense, I mean, this is a defense who's returning a lot of talent in the front 7 of the defense. But then you look on the secondary side, you're losing Arquan Bush, you're losing Javon Hicks. But then you wonder, all right, who's going to be some of those guys who step into that role? We've seen guys like Omarion Smith has stepped into that role. We saw that last season. But then you have Brian Threats, who's going to be fighting for a starting spot. I'm assuming he's going to maintain his starting spot after the season he had a season ago. But I'm fired up for what this defense can hold. And I think this defense could give some teams some trouble in the Big 12. And you definitely can't sleep on what Brian Brown is building. So this defense, it's going to be a fun season for this defense, for sure.
Defense is the great equalizer in the Big 12. And you mentioned the secondary. That's one position that I'm also a little concerned about, because a lot of guys, the players you mentioned who are leaving, Bush and Hicks, were responsible for a lot of the turnovers the Bearcats defense forced over the years. So who steps up and creates plays will be interesting to watch as the spring unfolds and into fall camp and the season. Real quick, Neil, before we transition to the hardwood, which transfer are you most excited to see this spring?
Yeah, so the transfer I'm most excited to see, I would have to go with Daniel Grisiak from Utah State, just because he dominated last year. I think he had 13 and a half sacks, if I remember right. But overall, like, you're adding him to a defensive line that has returned guys like Malik Van. Malik Van was a guy no one really kind of knew what was going to. Obviously, he got hurt versus Kennesaw State on like the first drive of the game, like second play. And that was the second game of the season. And it was just one of those injuries where it just knocked him out the whole season. And you hate to see that for a guy, especially for a guy like Malik. But overall, like, that defensive line, adding Grizzliak alongside Dante Corleone, Malik Van, and Jawan Briggs, I think that's going to be a fun front four to watch.
Should be good. Grizzliak is interesting because he can get to the quarterback from the film that you alluded to earlier, Neil. He can get to the quarterback from the D-line and the linebacker position. So really, really excited to see how this defense fares under a new coordinator and that 4-2-5 scheme as opposed to the 3-3-5 that we've seen in the last few seasons. All right, we're going to switch gears to the hardwood. The Bearcats closing out the regular season in dominant fashion yesterday on Senior Day against SMU. We'll talk about the momentum that could give them as they head into the conference tournament, and the Big 12, where the Bearcats will be in next year, has a wicked tough tournament this coming week. But what other conference tournaments are of interest? We'll talk with Neil about that after we hear from two of our sponsors. Neil Meyer of the Front Office News, and he's also a part of the 48 Minutes Network, joining me today here on Locked On Bearcats on this first day of spring ball. But yesterday, Neil, the final regular season game for Bearcats men's basketball, a 97-74 win over SMU. David DeJulius with a 30-point performance on Senior Day, 11 of 18 from the floor, 2 of 4 from three-point range. Also had 6 assists in 34 minutes of play. How good was the Bearcats' performance yesterday, Neil? None of them had a plus or minus in the negatives. In fact, the only two players who had 0 were Josh Reed and Chase Kirkwood, who played a combined 2 minutes. So that's how good the Bearcats were yesterday. Is this a performance, Neil, that is indicative of a team that can win the American tournament this week?
Yes, absolutely. I think everyone kind of knows what this team is capable of. And I mean, they had a week off to prepare for this, and I think that week off hit at the perfect time. I mean, they suffered a hard-fought loss to Memphis last Sunday where they turned the ball over 22 times to be exact. It was like a 22-8 differential on the turnovers. And then the points off turnovers in that game was 24-6. And the Bearcats fell to Memphis by just 3 points. And they fought back to the very end. However, they've really turned the page this afternoon versus SMU. And that was a good aspect, a good bounce back win. Obviously, they had the week off. But something that really stood out to me about this game, outside of David DeJulius and Landers Nolly's performance, was they're coming off a game where they had 22 turnovers versus a very good Memphis team. However, they turned the page and they had 20 assists today to just 8 turnovers throughout this game. So the ball was moving phenomenally. And I think this is the performance they needed to get on track heading into the American Athletic Conference this week, heading into Fort Worth, Texas. I don't know about you, Alex, but I will be down there covering the AAC tournament in Fort Worth.
Nice.
So I think they're building the momentum at the right time. I mean, to see what transpired at Fifth Third Arena yesterday with David DeJulius and Landers Nolly, and arguably what could have been Landers Nolly's final game at Fifth Third Arena. But man, was it special to just see David DeJulius set a new career high, 30 points, 6 assists. But just for a guy who has went through so much with this program, obviously he went through the coaching change with John Brandon to Wes Miller. He had options to go somewhere else, and he decided to stick here. And this is a guy who has been not only impacting the Bearcats on the court, but man, he has really impacted them off the court and impacted this community. He has gotten involved. We've heard Coach Miller mention ahead of this week of the things that David DeJulius has done off the court he said he gets emails and phone calls just about every day, maybe once or twice a day, sometimes a few a week, of things David DeJulius has done in the community. He really emphasized on what he has done. He shows up at elementary schools, preschools, and really makes an impact in this community. But man, I think the Bearcats are building momentum at the right time heading into March.
3-1 in their last 4 games, 6-3 in the second half of conference play, Neil. Those are two things that I can get behind. In the 3 games they lost, they very easily could have won. You mentioned the Memphis game last week. Shave those 20 turnovers. You were at that game in Memphis. If you shave those 20 turnovers a quarter down to 15, they might, and I think do, win that game. So, I mean, this team is really good offensively. We know they're very good at sharing the ball. We know they're very good at not turning the ball over. We know they're very good shooting the three. In yesterday's win, the Bearcats were 11 of 25 from three-point range. Nolly, 5 of 8. Now, one thing, first off, Neil, are you driving all the way down to Fort Worth, or are you
I'll
flying?
be flying.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be flying.
I was going to say, I mean, hats off to you if you were going to make the drive, but good for you that you've got a flight to Fort Worth, Texas, the final American tournament for the Cincinnati Bearcats. Jeremiah Davenport did look like he limped off the court at the end of the game yesterday. Have you heard anything about Davenport's status? If there's any update, because that was a scary sight to see at the end of the game.
Yeah, I don't think it was anything serious. I haven't heard anything yet update-wise, but he was back out for the final 30 seconds of that game. I think he maybe just tweaked something. I didn't get the greatest of looks from it from where I was sitting. But he was out for the team pictures and when they thanked the crowd. So he was with the team. He went through the handshake lines. I don't think it's going to be anything serious heading into the conference tournament. I expect him to be right out there and ready. So it was a good scene. It was definitely a scary scene to see him kind of tweak that knee and head out. But overall, I think Bearcats fans should be expecting to see him play come AAC tournament in their first matchup this Friday versus Temple.
It's going to be a very competitive game against Temple on Friday, 3 o'clock at Dickies Arena in Fort Worth, Texas. Just real quick, Neil, your thoughts on that game. We saw these two teams play a barn burner just 2 weeks ago in Fifth Third Arena, a game that Cincinnati won 88-83 in overtime behind 20-point efforts from David DeJulius and Landers Nolly. The Bearcats and Temple split their regular season meetings. What do you see happening on Friday in the quarterfinals of the tournament?
Yeah, so obviously the Bearcats have clinched a first-round bye, but they have that 4 versus 5 seed matchup versus Temple, which they split the season series with. Obviously, they fell to Temple at Temple, but then they responded with an 88-83 victory versus the Owls in overtime just over 2 weeks ago. But if you remember right, Alex, that Temple team, that they were without leading scorer Khalif Battle. I don't think we see him the rest of the year, if I'm being honest with you. He has not been practicing or playing as of late from the reports I have seen. I know he did not play today, but this is a Temple team. I mean, obviously everyone knows what Temple is capable of. Obviously, I thought Khalif Battle and Damian Dunn really complemented each other very well, but Damian Dunn went off. It just seemed like him and Landers Nolly were just trading bucket for bucket here at Fifth Third Arena just 2 weeks ago. But then that was a game that got a little chippy. I mean, obviously we saw Micah Adams-Woods take what looked to be, I don't know if he collided heads. Maybe he took like an elbow there. But Micah Adams-Woods took a pretty nasty headbutt, elbow, whatever it was. It drew some significant blood right above the eyebrow. And we've seen him play with the bandage above his right eyebrow for the last 2 weeks or so. Obviously, he's had one on at Memphis. He still wore the bandage yesterday versus SMU. So whatever it was, it had to be a pretty significant cut or cut, deep wound, whatever you would call that. But Mike Adams-Woods took a nice little barn burner on the right above the eye the last time these two played. Yeah. But then not only was it a pretty nasty cut, but can we just talk about how he came back in that game to finish it out after seeing the blood drip down from our seats above section 119? And that was only about 30 seconds later. He checked right back into the game, just threw a Band-Aid on it, and next thing you know, Mike Adams-Woods is still going out there. But I'm looking forward to this matchup. I think this is obviously going to be one of the best matchups to start off the tournament. Like, this is a Temple team that took Tulane to the wire yesterday. So, and Tulane, like, they were a hit or miss team. Obviously, they had to play 3 games in 5 days. Obviously, they had 2 at ECU back. They suffered a loss to Tulane in the first game, and then they come back, beat them 2 days later. But then Tulane has to go on the road, I believe, to Temple. Or was that game at Tulane?
It was in New Orleans, the game yesterday, which Tulane won by 1 point. So, yeah, you're right.
So this is a team, like, you never know what you're going to expect. But when these two teams do match up, I expect it to be another Damian Dunn versus Landers Nolley kind of battle back and forth, as we saw how chippy it got.
Yeah.
You saw how Damian Dunn took over. I think he was the first guy to score 30 versus UC in the last year, outside of the Arizona game when Tubelis went off. But then you look down and you see these two teams, like Landers Nolley went 4 for 4 in overtime after a slow start to that game. Landers Nolley chimed in when this team needed it the most, and he put the team on his back in overtime. I think he had 9 of the team's 13 points in overtime, went 4-4 from the field. So overall, I expect it to be another hard-fought battle, and I'm excited to watch another Damian Dunn versus Landers Nolley battle back and forth.
You'll have a front row seat to it at Dickies Arena. It should be a competitive game. These two teams have a lot of history. I think their last 9 games or something along those lines, Neil, have been decided points or less. So it's going to be, once again, a close game. The winner will face the winner of the first game on Friday, which will feature number 1 Houston against either 8th-seeded USF or 9th-seeded East Carolina. So Bearcats likely going to have to run through number 1 Houston, the number 1 team in the country, if they want a shot at playing for an NCAA tournament berth. So, Neil, you obviously, not only do you cover the Bearcats for the Front Office News, but you also host a college basketball podcast, part of the 48 Minutes Network. So the Big 12 tournament is going to be wicked awesome. We know that. I mean, just look at the first round games on Wednesday, and then your first quarterfinal game on Thursday is Iowa State versus Baylor. So, I mean, that's going to be some fun. And there are other tournaments as well. I personally, if you ask me, outside of the Big 12, the tournament I'm most looking forward to seeing, I'm saying the Big East, because I think there are so many teams in that conference, including Xavier, who can win it. And it's in Madison Square Garden. The Big East was a competitive conference all season. There's a lot of great players, a lot of head coaches, good coaches in that conference. You, Neil, what tournament outside of the Big 12 are you most looking forward to? Is it the Big East? Is it another conference that I haven't mentioned? What conference tournament next week are you looking forward to the most?
Yeah, so I'm going to agree with you. It's definitely the Big East. I mean, you look down at the latest AP poll from this week, and you're looking down, you have Marquette ranked as high as 6. Then you have, in the Big East, you have UConn at 14. Then you have Xavier at 19, Providence at 20. Like, Creighton sitting right outside the top 25. But that Big East, like, that's up for grabs for anybody. And, I mean, we've seen it as of late. Like, Marquette was picked to finish 9th in the preseason polls. And then Tyler Kolek stamped. I think Tyler Kolek has earned every right for Player of the Year in the Big East. I'm not sure if they announced those honors or whatnot yet, but for my vote for Player of the Year, obviously Sully Boom from Xavier had a fantastic season. Bryce Hopkins from Providence has had a fantastic season. But me personally, Tyler Kolek has had a phenomenal season for Marquette. I would throw Shaka Smart in there for Coach of the Year. And that's just my opinion, because this was a team that was predicted to rank 9th in the preseason polls. But what's so interesting about this Big East heading into the tournament, UConn was ranked as high as number 2 at one point, and then they fell off, and now they're battling their way back up. Creighton was a top 10 team to start the season. They saw them fall out of the top 25, and now they're starting to climb back into things. But then you also have a Xavier team who has been phenomenal this season. obviously led by Souley Boom. But then that Xavier team suffered a substantial injury to Zach Freemantle right around the beginning of February. And I don't know if many of you guys have been on social media lately, but Zach Freemantle has been, it just came out today that Xavier has shut him down and he is going to undergo foot surgery. So
Ooh.
Zach Freemantle will be out for the season for Xavier, which is a substantial blow. They were hoping to get him back for the Big East conference run. But from the reports I saw from Adam Baum from the Inquirer, who covers Xavier, who I know very well, sounds like Zach Freemantle just wasn't 100%. Sounds like from the reports that he tweeted out was the hope he could play through the pain, but ultimately they decided, the medical staff, and for Fremantle's sake, that it was safe to get the surgery now and make a full recovery. However, that's a big blow for the Musketeers. He was averaging nearly, I believe it was 14 points a game and 8 rebounds or so, maybe even closer to 9 rebounds. But that's a substantial blow for the Musketeers, because when Zach Freemantle and Jack Nungy both were healthy, and then you throw in Souley Boom, Adam Kunkel, and Colby Jones alongside, that Xavier team was dangerous. And then they bring in Desmond Claude off the bench. I thought that Xavier team before the injury, I hate to say it because obviously I went to the University of Cincinnati, but I'm just a big college basketball fan. That Xavier team was going to make a run, and I still think they're capable of making a run. Yeah. And to think, too, the injury bug struck Zach Freemantle once again, which you never like to see. But, man, that Xavier team, when they're on, they're on. Souley Boom is a phenomenal player. Colby Jones is climbing up draft boards. I think I saw him late as an early second rounder as of heading into this week. So I think of a great Big East tournament for Colby Jones heading into March. I think he could raise his draft stock into maybe even a late first-round pick. However, that Big East tournament, it's going to be fun to watch between teams like Marquette, Creighton. Ryan Kalkbrenner out of Creighton is a phenomenal big man. He's what makes that Creighton Blue Jays team go. But then you have Providence. Bryce Hopkins transferred from Kentucky to Providence this offseason, and him and Ed Croswell really, really complement each other very well. So, and both times the Friars and the Musketeers have matched up. It's been a 5-point game, a 3 to 5 point game. Like that Big East tournament, it's going to come down to a wire. And I would not be surprised to see a team like Creighton make a run in the Big East tournament. I would not.
Well, here's what I think about Neil. Villanova starting to get a little rhythm, and then even a team like Seton Hall. So you mentioned the top 3 teams who I'm really excited to see, but I think about Villanova, and even though they're on a first-year head coach, it's the month of March. We've seen what we have seen from them in previous years. So the Big East is going to be great. The Big Ten is going to be, you're probably going to have some wacko upset where like 9 beats 1 or 10 beats 2 or something. So that'll be fun. Pac-12's got 2 really good teams. You've got some bubble teams in the SEC. The ACC is going to be really interesting. North Carolina, how much they have to do to make the NCAA. North Carolina, Neil, real quick before we go. Are you saying they're a tournament team, or are they not a tournament team to you?
Right now, I would say they're not a tournament team. I would say I would still have them on the bubble. However, if they can make a run in the ACC tournament, I think it's very possible they sneak in. Obviously, I've said this on the At Large Bid podcast a few times with my co-host Parker Fields. I think the AAC is up for grabs. The ACC, it's up for grabs. I'm not high on Virginia, and I just don't think they have that much offense. They have Jaden Gardner, and that's about it. I think that Virginia team is very beatable, but it's March. You can never count out teams like North Carolina, like Duke. You just simply cannot count them out. But overall, that ACC tournament, it's going to be a fun one to watch. And you also have Pitt in that ACC tournament who is climbing up the polls. And then you have Miami of Florida's having a fantastic year. Clemson was the top 25 team at one point. So that ACC tournament could be another fun one to watch. But I think that's the tournament that is just about up for grabs for about anyone. But, however, you can never doubt North Carolina and Duke out, especially in the month of March.
Question about it. Speaking of which, coming up tonight, you've got, I think, one championship game tonight in Division One. Neil, you've got the Sun Belt Championship at 7 o'clock on ESPN2. No, you got two. You've got the Sun Belt, and then you've got the Ingles SoCon Championship. And Neil, it's a rematch of last year's epic championship game between Chattanooga and Furman. So looking forward to seeing that. You've got the West Coast semifinals tonight. You've got some other semifinal games, quarterfinal games tonight. I think we're looking at a Gonzaga St. Mary's round 3 tomorrow night, which, I mean, it's really interesting to see St. Mary's as the number 1 seed in that tournament. Gonzaga really kind of in a down year, and yet you still feel like they're one of the best teams in the country. So we'll see how that goes. Neil Meyer of the Front Office News, my guest today. He's a contributor for the Front Office News and 48 Minutes Network. Neil, it's been great. We'll try and get you on again Monday next week after Selection Sunday. Enjoy covering spring practice, and we'll talk to you soon, all right?
Yeah, definitely just want to give a quick thank you, Alex, for having me on. This was a lot of fun, so I look forward to doing this again in the future. So once again, thank you for having me on. It was a blast.
No question about it. Best wishes to you, and we'll talk to you soon. Neil Meyer of the Front Office News and 48 Minutes Network. I'm on Twitter at Frankie_90. Neil, by the way, is at Twitter at MeyerNeil6. I'm on Twitter at Frankie_90 with 2 N's and an ATI. Instagram, AlexFrank9_ and email, Alex3Frank@gmail.com. Thanks again for making Locked On Bearcats your first listen today. For your second listen, check out our brand new podcast, Locked On College Basketball. Experts Isaac Shade and Andy Patton bring you everything you need to know on and off the court. Plus, hear from big-name experts, coaches, and players throughout the basketball landscape. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Alex Frank for Locked On Bearcats. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Back tomorrow, looking at the Bearcats quarterback battle and the one problem that I have with it. Of course, later on this week, we'll try and get back to the live room with Russ Heltman, my colleague at All Bearcats and Sports Illustrated. Friday, a conference tournament preview, Bearcats and Temple Friday at 3, and the power of the number 31. I'll leave you to think about that this week. I'm Alex Frank for Locked On Bearcats. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll be back tomorrow right here on Locked On Bearcats.